Good morning, everyone. I'm Judy Mills, Group Vice President, Human Resources for Mediacom Communications. I'm glad you're with us this morning to hear about attracting diverse talent to your tech teams. Before I introduce Maria, I want to remind you that this session is
70-30
and will be available for on-demand viewing. Also, there will be a Q&A at the end of the session, so please post your questions by using the Ask button at the bottom of your screen. We're thrilled to have Maria Arias with us today. Maria is the principal of Arias Solutions, a consulting firm specializing in diversity and inclusion and multicultural initiatives. Let's get the session started. I'm pleased to introduce Maria Arias.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you here today to talk about attracting diverse talent to your tech team. First and foremost, before I get into my presentation, I want to thank C2HR for the ability to talk to everyone today. I hope that a lot of my former communications and media and programming professionals are here joining us. Today is Veterans Day, and so I want to do a shout out to all our veterans who are in our industry. I also want to recognize that even though diversity is defined very broadly and in many different ways, for example, veterans, the LGBTQ community, or the disabled community, and others, today's presentation is going to focus on women and people of color. So if we could advance. Let's go to the executive summary. If we could advance. Diversity in tech, as we all know, is an ongoing challenge. Many companies have been working on this for years, and there's been some progress, but much more can occur. We all know that diversity is smart for business. The studies have been out for years, but the current social environment demands that we look at this more carefully. From my perspective and based on my experience and what I've seen with a lot of companies, in order to attain sustained and meaningful progress, you really need an overall DEI framework. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. The other thing I want to provide to the group today is some insight on surveys from tech talent on areas of focus for recruiting, as well as what's important to them and the technology that can be used to address things like unconscious bias. I'd also like to highlight some best practices. I'm always being asked, so who does it right? I think for many of you out there who are diversity practitioners, you know this is a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. Let's advance to the next slide. Diversity in tech. Let's look at a couple of the stats. In the next two slides, if we could move to the next one, we'll see that there is some data about the major tech companies in terms of their racial and ethnic diversity. As you can see from this slide, we still have a situation where the predominant population in the tech industry and true tech roles is white and Caucasian, followed by the Asian community, and then the Latinx and Black and other communities. This data is emerging over time because companies are starting to report more and more. For example, recently a study came out, and interestingly enough, 90% of tech companies report on race and ethnicity and gender, but much less on age or, for example, on the disabled community. Let's look at the next slide where there's some stats on women in the workforce. And this represents the big tech companies, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and some of these other companies like Apple. Women are still underrepresented in tech, even though we know that they're at least 50% of the workforce. In this slide, you'll see how there may be a large percentage in the overall workforce, like at Amazon, but in leadership roles, it drops into the maybe 30s, but in high 20s. But as you look further down in tech, the numbers are in the low 20s. So let's go to the next slide. The business case for D&I. In the next slide, we talk about some of the studies that have been out, if you could advance. For example, if you could please advance the next slide. Diversity is smart business. We've seen the studies from the Peterson Institute, from McKinsey, about how having gender diversity and ethnic and cultural diversity are very important for the bottom line, and increasingly how leadership is focused on diversity. I think a lot of times we think about, well, there's studies, and I think other companies are now starting to see, both tech and non-tech, the results of that. Based on my experience after working on diversity and inclusion, for example, at a couple of companies, I knew that I had accomplished something when one of the business leaders in a one-on-one meeting came to us and said, I want to show you a chart. These are my business results for the past 2 years. These are my business results this year. This year, I have the most diverse team as a result of some diversity initiatives. And this goes to show that you were right. So there's theory and there's practice. And I can tell you that if you focus on diversity and inclusion in your leadership and in your tech and other workforce, it can happen and you can have better business results. Let's advance to the next slide. Job seekers value diversity. We see this in the news, and you'll see this in a couple of slides coming up. The millennial population is one of the most diverse in our country's history. They are 50% of the workforce, and they're going to be 75% of the global workforce, some are saying, by as close as 2025, not just 2030. This workforce, as we all know, values diversity. 86% of females and 74% of males consider that when looking for a job. And the up-and-coming Gen Z generation is going to be the most diverse and best educated and techie generation yet. Surveys indicate that 51% of those in Gen Z who are pursuing their education are working towards technical roles. They prioritize diversity across race, gender, orientation, and inclusion, and they definitely consider it when deciding where to go. If we advance, we know to the next slide, we've seen the value that employees have in terms of diversity and equity and inclusion. Studies have shown that when there's unfair treatment, that employee turnover occurs. $64 billion per year in employee replacement costs. In tech, it's approximately $16 billion. We saw in the last couple of years, starting in 2018 and 2019, the huge focus on the hashtag #MeToo movement and the hashtag Time's Up, and the employee walkouts and the employee protests that actually caused changes in organizations' policies as a result of the importance that their employees put on the issues of inclusion and addressing potential harassment issues. If we advance to the next slide, we see what's happening today. The unfortunate death of George Floyd and many other Blacks in our country and across the world have triggered not just a national, but an international movement for Black Lives Matter and the social and racial justice movement. Protests this year, protests continue. We've seen it with the election. The issue of social and racial justice is front and center, and it comes up every time in working with attracting diverse talent. If we advance to the next slide, we'll see that companies are responding to this issue. Tech companies, communications and media companies, the traditional phone companies, everyone is investing in this issue because they see the demographics of the country. One of the increasing populations and workforce is the biracial and multicultural employees of the future. And so you'll see that hundreds of millions of dollars, and you can advance to the next slide, for other companies are being dedicated to organizations, strong organizations that focus on the racial injustice movement for jobs, for education, for partnerships and internships. I think this is a great opportunity to spend the dollars wisely and focus on partnerships where you can work with organizations that can bring you a diverse pipeline of talent in development programs. If we advance to the next slide, we're going to talk about the framework. This is really important. If we could advance. The reason I say this is, if we could advance to the next slide, please. It's very important to have an overall framework. We've seen it over and over again where large organizations, medium-sized organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, hire someone, put them in a position, and they launch a lot of training. Honestly, the studies are back and forth on whether training works or doesn't work. Based on my experience, and my recommendation to you is it can work, but you need to have an overall framework. Because at the end of the day, particularly in today's environment, where information about your organization is available on so many internet sites, your potential employees are going to know whether you have a holistic plan or whether you have very discrete efforts. So if we advance to the next slide, we can talk about developing the overall plan. I know some of you already are in organizations where there is a strategic plan and a business plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion. At the end of the day, what gets measured gets done. If you don't have specific goals, it's going to be very difficult to know if you're making progress and to track your progress and to hold leadership accountable. And the metrics aren't just targets, because obviously quotas are illegal, but there can be aspirational goals and other metrics, as we've seen many organizations adopt in terms of their focus on hiring, but not just that, onboarding, development, and retention. If we advance, as we look, focusing on your D&I brand is incredibly important. It amazes me as I work with some clients how some may have a commitment to inclusion on their website or in their job application, and many others still don't. Or if you look at what is published on the website, there are videos that have some of the stereotypical positioning of the white population and whites in leadership and people of color and women and not active in leadership roles. It's really important to focus on your D&I brand, particularly when it, as we all know, especially in a remote working environment, that it's important that we focus on the brand for the organization. If we go to the next slide, understand what your employees think about DEI. For inclusion to be in part of the culture and understand what your leaders are thinking about D&I, consider launching a confidential survey or think about focus groups. It's really important to find out what your employees are thinking and know if there's any potential zones that you need to focus on. It's an opportunity as well to debunk myths. So, next slide. Let's think about making a diverse leadership hire. Hiring diverse candidates for visible management roles is going to help you increase your diverse hiring. You can't be who you can't see. So diverse talent will benefit from the role model. It's very easy to build a database of diverse candidates from some of the national diverse organizations. We can recruit diverse leaders when looking, for example, at the top 50 companies, and you can source diverse talent on LinkedIn, Indeed, and other online sources. And we can advance to the next slide. I want to make sure I'm being heard because I understand there might be some issues here, but I'm going to go ahead and move on. Implementing diverse slates to benefit the business is really important. I don't know how many times I've heard, but is there enough talent? Or I hate to say this, but it's been said to me, do we have to lower our standards? There is diverse talent. I have some information on that later in the presentation. And no, you don't have to lower your standards. Implementing diverse slates is a proven method for building a pipeline. In some organizations, you can require one, but studies really show that having at least 2 diverse candidates on a slate are really going to increase the ability of your organization to hire diverse tech talent in particular. A lot of times in working with tech clients, I've heard them say, I need 20 engineers. I need them now. And so looking at the interview and offer process to make sure it can accommodate for some diversity recruiting, and taking time to build the relationship with organizations to provide access to that diverse talent can be done. Ideally, all of your slates have diverse candidates, but we all understand that we need to fill a business need. So let's focus on getting at least one or two diverse candidates on a slate to increase your pipeline. We could advance to the next slide. Building a pipeline at select colleges and universities is really important. We've gotten the question, is there enough talent focused on computer science, in math, and some of the STEM careers? Yes, there is, actually. I've done a survey of some of the largest organizations. For example, College Factual publishes information on diverse talent at some of the top Ivy League universities and the technology-focused universities. And as you can see here, there's representation from many groups. And the historically Black colleges and the Hispanic serving institutions also have a focus on STEM computers. One of the things that makes a lot of sense and has been very successful for some organizations is to really focus on a couple of schools and instead of trying to search out connections and diverse talent at all of them. For example, here in Colorado, where I'm based, Ball Aerospace has a partnership with the University of Colorado in their engineering department, and they partner women in their organization, women engineers and other scientists, with college students, females in particular, so that they can help females and also women of color stay in their degree. Because studies have shown that even though women and people of color may enter into these STEM fields while in college, they tend to switch and drop out very quickly. So having that mentoring and onboarding and continuing support and mentorship helps build the pipeline. There's an opportunity for many of you to develop similar relationships with your local universities. Let's advance. These are some organizations, and I'm sure many of you partner with them: the Black Engineer, the Hispanic Engineers, Women Who Code, NAPABA. I include finance because oftentimes, as I'll show a little bit later, organizations take non-traditional candidates and train them into tech roles. I have the Society of Human Resources on here as an important partner because it helps to have diverse HR professionals if you're going to be attracting diverse talent. And one of the things that we've done successfully at some organizations is when attending some of the national or regional conferences for these tech-focused organizations, be there to do interviews, be there with potential job offers. That way, you have direct exposure to the potential candidates and you have the opportunity to do some of your hires. And also getting membership lists and resumes so that you can go back to your employer and then do on-site events. If we advance, let's go to tips for recruiting. On the next page, I highlight a couple of tech tips. One of the things that's near and dear to technologists, as many of you know, in trying to attack that talent, is pay. Many of the large tech organizations have allowed remote working, and particularly now in the environment with the pandemic, pretty much everybody's working remotely except for essential workers. A 2019 survey showed that the #1 thing that technologists consider is compensation. In the past, things like commute and reload were important, but in these days, it's really about compensation and responsibility. If we advance to the next slide, here's a couple of tips that are provided based on surveys of technologists and HR professionals. Improve your interview process by pre-selecting your candidates with technical screening software so that your team can save time. One of the things that I have found works very well with tech recruiting is for the leaders of technical departments to be involved in the recruiting once you have some final slates and final candidates. I had an organization, for example, that's a $3 billion company, but smaller as compared to some of the larger tech companies ask. So how can I hire employees away from Facebook and LinkedIn and Google and some of these enormous companies? And I said, show up to recruit them. The millennial generation wants exposure to leadership, and they want to know that they're going to have a long-term career and the ability to advance at the company that they're going to go to. Designing the right benefits. I mentioned on the prior slide that compensation is really important to these professionals. Well, according to a recent report of technologists, training and education are the number one thing beside compensation that technologists find very important. Yet only 40% of those surveys had access to those benefits. So training and certification benefits can differentiate your company with some of the other technical employers. If we advance, contact tech candidates with specific job information, particularly for diverse talent, women, people of color, the LGBT community, disabled community, veterans. They want to know the comp range, details on the company, and again, the personal touch. Why do you think they're an important fit for your company versus where they're at? And I'll talk about the issue of fit in a little bit. Communicate what they're actually going to be working with. What tech stack, like what technology do you have and what will you be evolving to? And know what specific skill sets you want to test. Later on, I'll talk a little bit about having very long requirements. It's going to be a burden and a barrier to getting tech talent, but know what you really need so that you can be more flexible as you search for and try to attract diverse talent to your organization. If we advance, keep your coding tests short and relevant. Technologists love to take these tests, but they want to know that it's based on the real work that they're going to do, that it's relatively short, and they want to see their grades because they like to compare themselves to their peers. And one of the things that studies have found is that your candidates are more likely to complete the test if you send it earlier in the week, not on the weekend. They want to protect their time. So as we advance to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about the use of technology. On the next page, we're going to highlight job descriptions. We've heard about this for a couple of years, but it really is important. Avoiding specific gender words like his or her, or words that are associated with males like aggressive, ambitious, intense, etc. In terms of gender, they, their, people, you. There's lots of different technology out there. Some of my clients use Textio very successfully to check the language in their job descriptions, language that might deter people of color and women from applying. And this is what I alluded to a little bit earlier, which is emphasize competencies and skills and values. And you have some requirements, but if you have a very long list of requirements, you're going to have a situation where women and people of color are going to be less likely to apply for your job. Diversity Boolean search strings on LinkedIn have been proven to be very successful. And for those of you who aren't familiar with those, it's basically tagging your search so that, for example, if you have a list of the national diverse sororities or fraternities or tech organizations, for example, like Shippy, if you put that in your search, it's going to be a quick and easy way to find a lot of diverse tech talent that otherwise might have taken you some time to find. And this is one that is an emerging process, as I've seen. Some companies are doing it. Some tech companies just are still not there, and that's blind resumes. We've heard the stories about how people have changed their names, people use certain names. I'm working with an artificial intelligence group right now where there are two women in particular who go by their last names, and they said, it impacted how I was recruited, it impacts how I was hired and my compensation, and it impacts how I'm treated here because I need to feel like I'm one of the guys. Blind resumes and even blind testing or like there's technology like gap jumpers, where it's a job board that allows employees to do some of the preliminary tests without providing very gender or ethnicity or race information. It allows you as a hiring manager to see the talent for what their skills and competencies are, and not for who they are in terms of their race, ethnicity, gender, orientation, or identity, etc. If we go to the next slide, I always get asked this: who's doing it right? So on the next slide, we have the top 20 Diversity Inc. companies. And I see my alma mater, Comcast NBC Universal, high on the list, which makes me very happy. But you'll see what's missing here. Some of you are on this top company list, which is a very thorough and extensive benchmarking organization, which is holistic. It's not just about tech talent, and I recognize that, but it's considered as part of the process. But what you see here are a lot of organizations that are consumer facing, focus on healthcare, focus on consulting. And many of these organizations are global organizations that absolutely, in order to serve their customers, their clients, their base, they need to have a diverse and inclusive workforce in order to be successful. You don't see the tech companies here. You don't see them because either they don't participate or they didn't make the list. On the next slide, this is an organization that I hope many of you are familiar with, which is the Unit Board organization. They really focus on women technologists and women of color. And every year they do a pretty rigorous benchmarking in which they look at organizations and they stratify them by the size of their tech workforce. So this is a deeper dive into organizations' work, in particular with women and women in tech and women of color. And so, for example, they stratify by under 1,000, under 10,000, and over 10,000. And many of these, I encourage you to look at some of the best practices in these organizations, because it's great to see what other organizations are doing. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what ThoughtWorks Strategies is doing. This is an organization that's highlighted because it takes in a lot of non-traditional candidates. They cast a wide net for talent beyond computer sci degrees. They look at disciplines like liberal arts and economics and mechanical engineering, and they bring their talent in and they train them. They have an immersive onboarding experience called the First Year Experience. It provides customized support, including training, coaching, and frequent check-ins and career pathing. And they focus on the culture. So again, this is a more holistic approach where it's not just bringing diverse talent in, but there's a onboarding support system. And then for the environment in the organization, they're focused on culture. And I'll tell you, I think one of the things that's really important to understand from a personal perspective is that so oftentimes diverse talent is the only one, particularly women of color, in tech organizations. I did an interview recently of a woman of color in a high-tech organization, and she said, I have this imposter syndrome. And what is that? Despite how accomplished she is, despite how successful she is in her work at the organization, she's not as confident as she used to be. She has a lot of self-doubt. And in fact, it's just caused by the environment of being the only one. So it's really important as you bring in diverse talent, if you don't have highly diverse organizations, to have some kind of support system for that one person. I'll tell you, throughout my entire career, I was like the only lawyer in a room, the only female partner in a room, the only, female this or female that. And you get used to it over time and you learn how to accommodate, particularly in these racially charged times where people of color feel like the focus is so much on them and where organizations go to them to try to fix the problem, when honestly, it's not about your African-American community employees fixing the problem. It's about you and your organization and trying to understand, what is my company like? And how can I make it a better organization for other employees and not just the majority? If we go to the next slide, PwC has a very strong program helping women advance. So this, closing the gender gap, is really important to them, but they have a survey of their male managers. And as a result of the #MeToo movement, 60% of the male managers are uncomfortable and worried about mentoring or working alone with the women. Now, the pandemic has solved some of that, right? Not the solution we want, because everyone's working from home. But it's really important to recognize that the social and cultural environment is impacting either the progress forward or backward of our organizations and our goal to have a more inclusive and a more diverse workforce. So PwC focuses on a 2-day program for their potential female partner candidates. Each one has a formal sponsor, and they have dedicated modules in their 3-year curriculum to talk about gender-related issues. And while the proteges and the potential partner candidates are their sponsors are a mix of male and female. And while I am a huge fan of having, like, for example, I'm a woman of color, I would love to have a woman of color be my sponsor. But the truth is, the success in my career was from a series of male sponsors, people who put their reputation behind me, people who took the time to learn about me, to work with me, to highlight my strengths and to help me work on my weaknesses, and to take me to the dinners with the high-ranking executives in the organization, to push me, to put me on lists for potential jobs. Those are the kind of programs that help your organization not just get diverse talent in, but help them be successful in getting into leadership positions. On the next slide, we'll talk about ADP. The focus on ADP and why I highlight them, especially during this pandemic, when so many people, so many professionals are working at home, and they have children at home who maybe some are going to school, but a lot of them are studying and being educated remotely. ADP has focused and has been successful in working and providing flexibility to enhance their female workforce and providing them with networking opportunities for leadership, workplace flexibility on remote working, and an inclusive culture. And they also have an annual leadership event to be able to provide the networking opportunity and to focus on issues and topics of leadership and the issues of working mothers. On the next slide, we have Accenture, another very large organization. The reason I wanted to highlight Accenture is that several years ago, they made public commitments about getting to gender parity and about increasing women in their leadership. They set a goal of gender parity by 2025 and managing partners of 25% by 2020. Today, their workforce is 44% women, so they're getting there, and 24% of their managing partners are female. And how did they get to this point? Well, it goes back to my earlier slide, which is they have a holistic plan. They have a plan for D&I. They hold leaders accountable. They collect data. They measure it, and they publish it, and they're transparent. On the next slide, and in the next section, I want to talk a little bit about 2 of the large companies. Given the pressure of the social and racial environment right now, some of the larger companies, in addition to donating and pledging millions of dollars, they're looking at adopting specific programs to prioritize diversity and inclusion. Google, like many of the other large tech companies, for years have spent a lot of money, but now companies like Google's are actually going public with some goals. They now want to have 30% more of its leaders be from underrepresented groups by 2025. They currently have 96% in the US are white or Asian, and 73% globally are men. So that's a pretty big challenge. On the next page, you'll see Facebook. They have a variety of programs to boost diverse hires. For example, they actually take potential candidates and teach them how to take some of the coding tests, and how to interview. When you think about it, there's a lot, the studies have shown that even if you are from a high socioeconomic status and have strong education, people of color tend to score lower than whites. And so what Facebook has done is they work with their candidates so that they know how to interview, and so they get adept at taking their coding exams. They also have an engineer in residence program at the historically Black and Hispanic serving institutions, and they have their own training program. On the next slide, in the next section, I really wanted to raise these questions for all of you. And I will definitely look now at some of the questions, and I encourage you all to send questions to the Ask box. But when I think about best practices and attracting diverse talent, and again, this presentation focused on women and people of color, I think we need to have a broader discussion about the disabled community, the LGBTQ community, veterans, and other diverse and underrepresented communities. But what's your framework for diversity and recruiting in tech? Do you source broadly in terms of tech and non-tech degrees? Or are you relying a lot on referrals? You see this in smaller tech organizations that don't have diversity because most of their new hires are the friends or acquaintances of their existing talent. And that practice is perpetuated because there's an employee bonus for those referrals. And it brings a sameness. Do you have strong relationships with the HBCUs and HSIs or local universities and the STEM degree departments? Have you evaluated the language in your job description? Have you, or would you be willing to review resumes blindly? And who conducts your interviews? Who participates? And how are the interviews structured? All of these are part of the attracting diverse talent to your organization. But as importantly, as I touched upon, having an onboarding plan and having some system and some processes and initiatives within your organizations to ensure that you can keep that diverse talent and grow them in your organization. So with that, I am actually going to go to see what questions may be in the queue for us in terms of diversity in tech. And I see the first one, which is in terms of measuring progress. I measured qualitative goals as well as quantitative goals. And what's an example of a qualitative goal? So one of the things that organizations have looked at, and particularly those who want to see immediate progress on this issue, is qualitative goals for leadership. Is your leadership involved in diversity and inclusion and equity initiatives? So for example, if you have employee resource groups, are they an executive champion? Have they participated in any event? Are they a mentor or are they your sponsor? These are examples of qualitative metrics and initiatives that you can put in your organization to try to get your leadership involved. Because again, it's not about just hitting a number. It's about having an inclusive culture so that your diverse talent will stay with you. How do you handle situations when you know a tech group has a certain style and the business has a different style, and the leader is concerned about the fit? I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, and I'm glad the question came in. You know, studies have shown that if you're hiring for fit, you're hiring for sameness. The whole theory behind inclusion, spurring innovation, and driving better business results is that you get different perspectives. It's not about culture fit, it's about culture add. What value can that diverse talent bring to your group and your organization? I alluded to a little bit earlier about a business leader who said, this is the most diverse team I've ever had, and these are the best results I've had. You know, he referenced in particular the women he was working with. He said, they challenge me every day because they come in with a different perspective. So my recommendation is, yes, you need to help your diverse talent. You need to let them know kind of what the culture of the organization is, but you also have to be open and willing to learn from them, and whether it's communication style, work style, collaborative, competitive. Again, I'm getting to those those male dominated culture words versus the collaborative, more flexible situations that a lot of diverse talent are looking for because they want to be able to fit in, but they want to be their whole selves and authentic. What are the most important components of a stay plan to keep young, gen, diverse talent in your organization more than a couple of years? I will tell you that probably the most important thing is, and it depends too, because there are flat organizations, but I think many of the participating companies are large organizations. It's having a cultural outlet for them within the organization, having a career path for them in the organization, and keeping them engaged through pulse surveys and trying to understand what it is that's important to them. Again, I mentioned a little bit earlier, trainings and certifications for their advancement are going to be very important. And the issue of keeping diverse talent is a huge one. Having your culture be a welcoming culture and one where employees want to stay is part of the equation, because otherwise diverse talent is just going to be migrating from company to company to company. Again, a client I have that I'm working with right now, they actually have a great representation of women, but they're really unhappy because it is such a data-driven and intense and highly competitive culture that they just don't feel like they can fit in and they can be successful because they don't feel like their voices are heard. So making sure that you're looking at some of the cultural aspects in your organization and connecting them to kind of the ultimate goal and mission of your organization, because millennials have voiced their concern about society and social impact, but Gen Z is very, very focused on the societal impact, in part, again, because of the political and social environment that we have right now, with the focus on what is the future that we're leaving this generation with death and global warming, et cetera. So it's kind of a multifaceted approach, part of it career, and part of it the culture of your organization. Let's see. You mentioned onboarding as important. How do you handle situations when you're hiring the first women or first woman of color in a tech group? Great question. One of the things that's really important is to connect your hire, your only one, whether it's a woman of color, a person who has a disability, any form of diversity. It's really important to get them a buddy or a mentor. I will tell you that many times individuals go into an organization and they've been recruited and they love the mission and they love this exciting work, but they just, again, feel like there's no one else there and there's no one there to support them. And finding a support system within your organization, whether it's a female or not, and if you don't have any in your group, there are other groups, or partnering and finding a support system for your hire outside of the organization. For example, encouraging your female employee to join, say it's a coder, join Women That Code, join different organizations and support their involvement in them, because there's power and strength. I'm a big fan of providing onboarding support of just not someone from your community, but someone in a position of authority, because it's very helpful for someone coming in who's new to know the lay of the land, who has power, who doesn't, what's considered success, what's the style of the organization. All these things are not going to be immediately known by the new hire. And so it's important to connect them so that they're not trying to navigate just the new environment by themselves and hit lots of different landmines. Any advice on how to educate hiring managers on the importance of building diversity interview slates? So I think the best way to convince your hiring managers to focus on diverse slates is to find out why they don't want to do it in the first place. Is it because of the time constraint to hire? Is it because they don't know how to source? What is the barrier? You know, SHRM, the Society of Human Resources, recently did a study on why certain organizations have diversity initiatives and why others don't. And believe it or not, that one of the top reasons why the organizations don't have more initiatives is because they think their organization is sufficiently diverse, and it may well be, but it's not diverse at the top, which is something that talent is always going to look at. And some of it honestly needs just the resources. So I think if you, particularly in these difficult times, and there's a lot of remote hiring, it's finding out what the barriers are to having that diverse slate and trying to help your HR managers do that. Also your leadership, you know, does your organization have a commitment to diversity, and are they willing to require diverse slates? You know, some organizations do it at a certain level and above, other organizations across. Some have certain timelines because they just have to meet the business needs. You know, I had one organization where 50%, you know, the deal struck was 50% of the slates will have diverse individuals on it, and others won't because they just needed to staff the organization. So there's a lot of ways to approach it, but the first and threshold question I would have is, why are there certain barriers preventing that, and how can those barriers be addressed? And how do you support your HR manager in doing that? Let's see. Have you worked with a company that hires self-taught coders, and has it been successful? Yes, there's a payroll organization based in Chicago that I've worked with that encourages self-taught coders, and actually started doing certification training within their organization based on employees' interest in learning the skill. So, you know, for example, just like with other organizations, tech and non-tech, there tend to be women in certain roles within the organization, in HR and customer care, in communications. And sometimes you have individuals that just have a facility with math and with logic. And so finding that talent within your organization through hackathons and cross-functional projects to try to spot who has certain skills and competencies will be very helpful in finding employees within your organization, so that you can recruit them and get the training that they need. I know we still have a few minutes left. See if there's any other questions. And again, I encourage you to go to your Ask box on your screen and add some questions. I have one more. You had benchmarking for some top companies for women. What about people of color? So there is some data comparing, and there are reports and there are surveys, but there, to my knowledge, and I'd love your input if you found one, I have not seen, for example, benchmarking in the way that Diversity Inc. does it, or the way that Anita Borg does it for people of color that includes male and females. There are more and more studies and reports, for example, of diverse professionals that are out there talking about the experience of diverse talent in tech. But that's one of the things we need more reporting. For example, for the disabled community, there's very few companies that actually publish their information. And part of this, you know, where the lines of privacy come into play, because employees have the right to self-identify or not. The same thing with the LGBTQ community. So what we're working with is the information that companies are willing to publish. So there isn't any government mandate. And as time goes on, I think that there will be increasing encouragement or pressure to provide more reporting on diversity for not just women or people of color as a whole, but you know, some companies are stepping up to the plate and actually reporting more specifically on their tech talent. Let's see, do we have any other questions? I don't see any others come in. So I just want to take the opportunity to thank everyone for being part of this dialogue, and particularly in this remote environment. Hopefully at some point in the future, we can have these discussions in person and do breakout sessions and talk about best practices, because I'm sure there are many others that your organizations have been working with over time. I will tell you that after working with multiple tech organizations and having done interviews of both people and women of color in leadership, there is a very strong role for male allies in this. Increasingly, the surveys that I'm seeing, the male leadership as well as the technical staff, they want more diversity. They want, but they don't know how to do it. So again, your role as professionals in the HR world and as champions of diversity is really important, because there's a lot of talent out there and they want to fit in and they want to be successful, but it's really up to us to help them get there. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close the session since there are no more questions, and I want to thank everyone for participating. If there's any other questions that you may have, please feel free to send them in, and I'm sure that we can work with C2HR to get those questions up on the app with some answers and or resources for you. And I just want to say on behalf of all the technical employees that I've worked with over the past couple of years, it's great that so many of your organizations are focused on this issue, because it's really about the technologists of the future, and we need diverse tech talent. We need them working on our artificial intelligence and all of the advanced technologies to make sure that they're including the perspectives and the ideas of different communities. Thank you, everyone.
Put the ultimate in high-fidelity music listening within the reach of everyone. The tape is now completely wildly rebound, ready for play.
All in thrilling new sound.